In this video, I want to talk about the trauma module of education and self-care that I would have liked to have received from any of the therapists that I worked with and feel is quite important to integrate into the Human Awareness Institute workshops in two areas. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is the participant introduction to trauma. And where this begins is prior to taking a high workshop, receiving, among other things, a questionnaire that helps each of us get in touch with the childhood experiences. You see, like me, you may not have known that in the Adverse Childhood Experience Study, as one example, middle-aged, middle-class Americans are still showing major impacts over a lifetime from childhood incidents. And what the Adverse Childhood Experience Study does is it allows us in literally 10 minutes to get a sense of our headwind. Now, what I mean by headwind is the influence or the probable influence of what we're having to move against in order to make headway. So in a plane scenario where a plane is flying with the wind, it can use less fuel and still arrive early. Now, a plane flying against a very strong headwind will use more fuel and arrive late. Now, the reason understanding one's headwind is so important is that when we fail, or when we are becoming exhausted in the process of our success, and we don't know why, we don't understand the phenomena of traumatic headwind, we do what every child throughout history has done. We blame ourselves as a mechanism for creating an illusion of more power than we actually have. And so particularly in areas of fear and uncertainty, there is a very strong instinct in human beings to take responsibility for something that's actually an external influence. But this is profoundly unkind in this psychological terrain, because what it means is that we've been hurt, often in many layers, and this has ongoing impact in a culture that does not actively heal that hurt. Now, that hurt creates drag. And in a culture that is capable of hurting its children and citizens, and then capable of ignoring and shaming the effects of that hurt, for you and I to add our own self-criticism, why aren't I going faster, etc., is profoundly unkind and ineffective. But if we can understand, wow, I'm in the category where, for example, people who answer yes to 4 or more of the adverse childhood experience questions are, I believe it's 5,000 times more likely to commit suicide. Well, if you realize that you are in that high category where you've got a very strong headwind as a result of the influences of different child and adult experiences, but you only feel suicidal once a month, rather, or as opposed to actually carrying it out, you can realize for the headwind that you're dealing with, it's like if you're flying against a 500 mile per hour wind and you're a jet flying, with 600 mile per hour jet engines, absolutely gunning those engines, you're just going to be making 100 miles per hour progress against that headwind. But there is nothing wrong with your engines. There's nothing wrong with your fuel. There's nothing wrong with your plane. You are in an environment in which that's what it takes to make just a little bit of of progress against that headwind. And this actually builds pride, builds esteem, because there's, while we all have different backgrounds and thus different influences shaping us in different directions, none of us are fundamentally better or worse than the others. We're just dealing with different goals, different values, and what I'm calling headwinds. So by taking the Adverse Childhood Questionnaire in advance, in this case, I would know, I'm in quite a high category of between 4 and 6. 4 being strong yeses, 2 being questionable, or variable. Yes, I can some of that, some not. It alerts us that trauma is going to be a big deal in this terrain. Now, when that trauma happens in a family setting, and we're learning about love, intimacy, and sexuality, it alerts us it's going to be a really big deal. Why? Because the trauma is happening in relational terrain, and every romantic relationship we have is going to pass through that bombed out terrain. This psychological geography softens with time, but it is not eradicated completely. I've done over 1,000 hours of inner child meditation, just as one example of many efforts. More than $150,000 of therapy, up to 3 therapists a week for 2-hour sessions, 6 hours a week for years. And of course I'm tearing my hair out. Why isn't stuff shifting? And to not have this even addressed in workshops where the mission statement is a commitment to everyone winning is a disservice. So as we take the Adverse Childhood Questionnaire and get a sense of our headwind, the next thing that we need to take care of ourselves are clues that we're in traumatic terrain. This is another big blind spot. So I don't know how therapists and healers are being trained, but in 30 practitioner sessions, including 4 high facilitators, the word trauma never came up. There was no questionnaire about childhood, etc. And there was no mention of the definition or ways to detect that trauma is present. So how do you detect that trauma is present? One is overwhelm. One is irrational behavior. And one is a fight, flight, freeze reaction, and or dissociation, the sense of leaving one's body and being overwhelmed. Now, why is this so important to recognize as terrain? Because this is the module that I'd like to have taught in a level 1, is to first of all say, America is a land of trauma. In conservative studies, it's estimated that 60% or more of the population, these are conservative, have unresolved trauma. Now, why is this such a big deal? It's a big deal because trauma is a phenomena in which there is a visceral experience and perception that one's life is in danger. Now, this triggers a biological response of fight, flight, freeze, and or dissociation. Now, why is that such a big deal? Because this circuit of the body is not governed by the rational mind. That's why I say that you want to look for irrational behavior. Now, as I look back on the 30 lovers that I've spent time with High, there has been an irrational element in almost all of those relationships. Now, what do I mean by an irrational element? Well, I mean looking into someone's eyes and seeing sheer terror and saying, what's going on? Are you okay? Everything's fine, everything's fine. That's irrational. See, someone who is not in a traumatic state of some kind, getting too close to a dissociated memory, getting too close to terrain that triggers traumatic fears or traumatic memories, reenacting certain elements of a trauma. Abandonment. See, for an infant, abandonment is a trauma. Now, if you were abandoned multiple times as an infant, and you've dissociated that terror. Now, dissociation means to disconnect, to not integrate. Now, when you disintegrate the self, you've now got a 2-year-old that is eternally 2 years old, and it's terrified. Why is it terrified? Because it absolutely depends on a mother and or a father to keep it alive. And rather than keeping it alive, these people have created an environment that is so unattuned, so dysregulated with the energy patterns and needs and intensity comfort levels of that infant, that it has had to leave its body to cope with the panic. That's not a safe environment. And when this happens repeatedly, there is a deep biological life and death fear. And it's 2 years old. Well, when it's dissociated at 2 years old, what it means is that when we come close to that terrain again, for example, of abandonment, and we are a culture of deep abandonment and betrayal on so many levels, well, there's a part of us that we don't know that's there, that's 2 years old, that's reenacting and re-experiencing that terror all again as if it's going to die. Because at 2-year-old, you would die if your partner cheated on you and hurt you and was violent with you and all that. And you're not going to die as a 20, 30, 40, 50-year-old. But some part of you doesn't know you're that old because it's dissociated. Well, why? Why has deep parts of trauma been left in a dissociated state for decades? Why indeed? We are an emotionally illiterate society. So it's not abnormal that you're dissociated at different ages. It's abnormal that you even know what dissociation means in this culture. We're that illiterate on an emotional level. Now, we may be able to fly, drive, type, make money, do this, look good, but we don't know the fundamentals of trauma, which is why we're not going to have a world in which everyone wins. When we have an emotionally illiterate world with traumatized individuals who don't have the skill to protect themselves from reenacting their trauma, or to stop traumatizing other people. And so one of the coping mechanisms, for example, that I developed as a traumatized child that couldn't trust either parents is I pushed boundaries. My mom or dad would say this or that, but I realized I wasn't safe with that. I could get a big shock if I trusted those words. So I had to kind of feel my way in there and push till I found something solid. And if I found something solid and consistent in their behavior, every time their eye moved like this, it meant this. Every time their facial did this, every time there was a raise of voice like this, it meant this. And it didn't matter what they were saying. Then I felt safe. So, dealing with dissociated, unintegrated, not fully aware individuals, which is pretty much all of us. We are in an emotionally illiterate world. I then push into those places. And a lot of those masks and covers and shields that people put up are actually to protect their traumatized wounds. And they're protecting them so well, they don't even know they're there. And this gets into that irrational field. So the first thing that I would want to know is if you are behaving irrationally, or if your partner is behaving irrationally, and upon realizing it, you cannot change the behavior. What I mean by that is you meet an overwhelming emotional wall when you try and take the awareness that I'm behaving irrationally and turn it into, how do I be rational? This is what I would do. Now, if you can say, wow, I'm behaving irrationally, and this is what rationality looks like, and you can pivot and start behaving rationally, that's probably not trauma. Where you detect trauma is, I know it's irrational. It doesn't seem to be good for me. It doesn't seem to be good for my partner. I don't know why. I don't know how. But when I try and behave what seems to be rationally, I just hit a wall and I can't do it. Now, I've had this my entire life. Total transparency about what's going on. But this I can change easily. This I can talk about easily, but I can't get anywhere near it without entering into such an amped up emotional state. I just can't do it. Now we're dealing with trauma. Now here's why. Trauma, being a life and death phenomena, happening in a species that is a pack species. 100,000 years ago, we were up in the trees in a pack of monkeys. And when you're a pack animal, you are not safe unless you have the support and protection of your pack. Now, you can get traumatized alone and dissociated, but to come back, you need the pack. You need support. Now, that's the technicality of trauma. That's the reality of the biology of trauma. But it is not the biology, the reality or biology of our culture. Our culture shames need. Well, this is a big problem because every single one of us has a domain within us that is absolutely scientifically needy. We've got to face the physics of our survival and reconcile our culture with that. But in part because of the betrayal that goes on for so many of us, those deep reservoirs of need that have not been fulfilled and honored, often since childhood, are replaced with a veneer that honors and rewards the appearance of cavalier disregard for need. I don't need anyone. And you will see this in hurt people. If you have a partner that has pain and fear in their face, and having experienced something not going the way they needed at a deep level for it to go for them to feel safe, who says, I don't need you, I don't need anything, I'm fine. You know you're dealing with someone in a traumatized state, in a shamed state. They've had a need, it hasn't been met, often because they didn't know how to articulate it in an emotionally literate culture. It's completely rational. It hasn't been met. And rather than feeling the helplessness and the grief of not having deep needs met, we dissociate from the need, and now we put forth a persona that says, I don't need. And the illusion of power is that you can't betray me if I didn't need anything to begin with. But it is the same childhood pattern of veneering a deep need at the level of physics. Our biology needs other people to come out of trauma. Every single one of us needed enough love and support to keep us alive, or we'd be dead. Within 2 days of not being cared for by, a parent, a guardian, we were dead as a baby. We have needs. We need one another. Every single thing that we own is on the shoulders of millions of people. There are millions of man-hours inside every single phone to get at technology to this point. We are so interdependent that it's a joke to build a culture on the basis of I don't need anyone. I'm just me. I'm completely detached and all that. But this joke is actually what it's actually saying about the culture is that we are so traumatized and so many of our needs have not been met that the sociopathic state in which we don't feel our need has become a pinnacle of aspiration. What's the word? Cool. On the empathic sociopathic continuum, cool is sociopathic. Warm is empathic. I don't want to be warm. I don't want to feel needy. So, having just a brief overview of this and looking for the clues, we then can develop a symbol. And we can start doing a few exercises and a few group shares in which people go into a certain amount of trauma and receive the love, the containment, the caring, to come back into their body and realize they are safe here in this moment in time. Now this is really key because I left my body in 2 ways in 50% of my 30 high workshops. One way was my back would just spasm out about 12 to 36 hours before a workshop. It would just completely spasm. And I would be hobbled and just able to move very slowly in the workshop. And I had no idea what this meant or what to do about it. It is a traumatic response. It's letting me know I have all this history, belief, and baggage around the safety of people in close relationships. And I'm going in to very close, vulnerable settings. And I haven't dealt with any of that trauma. And no one's prepared me for it. I'm not safe. This is my low back speaking. Now, the other phenomena was dissociating, leaving my body during large group shares. And a final phenomena was compulsive elements, having to do certain things compulsively to stay safe. This is all traumatic language. Now, when we know what to do about it, how to shake, how to talk about it, when we have language, the whole thing starts becoming safer. It becomes incredibly important when we get into those terrain where, I remember one of my high relationships in which she would fall asleep as soon as we turned the topic towards what I now know was her area of trauma. She would just fall asleep. Now, this was absolutely maddening because she would fall asleep right and left. Now, this was perfectly obvious and became, like after 5-6 times within seconds, you're asleep, like you can't get to sleep. But now that we're talking about this, you can't stay up. Oh, I'm so sorry, I'm just so tired. So we're dealing with irrational terrain. So I bring it up. See, in my traumatic history, I can't deal with lies. I cannot deal with lies. They terrify me. Because anytime I trusted my parents' lies, I got hurt hard. So I've got to see behavior lining up with words in order to feel safe. So the issue was not disturbing to me that she was falling asleep, and then she can't get to sleep. Up, she fell asleep. That's not disturbing to me. It's just an obvious pattern. When I bring it up in the daytime when there's no possibility of falling asleep and say, every single time I want to do this, you fall asleep, she says, no, I don't. I say, well, let's add up. Day here, bring it up, you were asleep in 2 minutes. Day here. Now you think bringing this up, do you want to talk about it now? No, you don't, do you? No, but you think I'm just completely out to lunch on this. I've tracked it. And she said, I don't know what you're talking about. This becomes alarming. Something's, because this is symbol for my 2-year-old, for my 6-year-old, that we are in danger. So I now have no sensitivity, not understanding trauma at all, because remember, I've gone through 30 lover relationships with complete ignorance on the word and the meaning of my own or other people's trauma. And this is why it's so unkind. It's so terribly unkind to teach loving relationships and win-win when there's no possibility of that, without in some way dealing with this big pink elephant in the room, which, if more than 60% in conservative statistics are dealing with it, what it means is that if you don't have trauma, your partner does. Well, if your partner is going to be irrationally destructive, and particularly then not own it and not be able to do anything, and you don't have any language, like what the fuck's going on here? And you don't have a story that says maybe it's trauma, maybe it's in the biology, maybe we need to see a trauma therapist. Instead, you think, what? My partner's crazy. She doesn't care about me. She's lying. This is not good. I don't want a partner that lies to me. I don't want a partner who doesn't care. I don't want a partner who behaves insanely and then really scares me by not even getting it. And so what happens when we don't understand trauma is facing the unknown is in itself for many of us, a traumatic event. Meaning, when you've been hurt a lot when you're young, having something that's unknown is dangerous. Because when you're hurt a lot as a young person, the world, as an expression, a magnified expression of those experiences, becomes a scary place. Which means that anything that's unknown probably has fear. Which means it has something probably that's scary that we need to be careful of. But we don't know what it is, so we can't prepare for it. And if we can't prepare for it, but it's there, it elevates the adrenals. It recreates the traumatic state. So in this case, it was one of the reasons we broke up. Because when my fear level goes up, I'm completely unable to talk to her about why, I go into sarcastic, scornful attack and push harder because I'm dealing with a threat. So my response to this area of hypersensitivity for her is, what the hell are you talking about? It's this, 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 this. Now I can take you there right now, and you're going to resist it. You ready? Okay, watch. Let's talk about this. No, you don't want to. What's your fucking excuse now? And you don't get it. I mean, how dumb do you have to be 100% avoiding this terrain and still saying you're not? I'm not having a problem with you. So you can imagine interacting with this Dane. Now, beneath that is terror like hell. I'm dealing with fears of survival. But she doesn't feel that way. She feels, what? She makes up a story about my trauma. Maybe I need to be right so much that I could care less about her feeling. So she bursts into tears. But I'm in a dissociative state, which is a sociopathic state, because I'm terrified. And I don't know how to deal with it, because I'm dealing with this huge lie that's right in our face. And she seems to think she's not going to be safe unless she can keep the lie alive. But I feel that I'm not safe unless I can talk with my partner about the reality of the pattern that's playing out. And so I protect myself in various ways, like, okay, I'm not even going to get into this relationship with you unless you agree to go to therapy if I feel it's necessary. I'll go if you think it's necessary. But are you willing to agree with that? Well, a lot of women weren't. So no relationship with them, So it's this sense of this terrifying moment in which something irrational is playing out that's elevating my fear to a level where I can't love from that place. And it's being completely denied, which means it can't be resolved. Because I could have dealt with any truth. If she said, I'm absolutely terrified of abandonment and it's so overwhelming I can't go there, so I'm going to go to sleep on this and that and the other. Can you live with that? And just know that I'm sorry I avoid you there. I can deal with that because that's not a trauma-producing lie. The thing that hurt me as a child was not my parents saying we're completely inadequate as parents, this and that and the other. Can you please accept our apology? That would have been easy. The thing that hurt me and my siblings was having two parents that had to be perfect, which meant anytime they weren't, they had to lie because they couldn't accept their imperfections, because their own panics of this and that and the other. So they had to be incredibly atrocious parents in various areas and simultaneously maintain the facade that they were perfect. That is dangerous. That's crazy making. How can a child learn reality in that dynamic? So this is a big deal. Now, developing a few exercises to find those areas and then come back to a safe place, to talk about them, to use a language, just opens up possibilities. Now, for the team, of course, it needs to be a lot deeper, because a team member is going to be holding participants in trauma. It's going to be spotting people that seem to be stumbling around out of their body, is going to need to know what to do. And so I think that a second day of team workshop is nothing but trauma. Having every team member read the book, The Body Keeps the Score, the best trauma book that I've found. Definitely beneficial to read the other books, including Peter Levine's book. But The Body Keeps the Score explores the terrain, number one. Number two, team members need to have some level of confidence dealing with their own trauma. How are they going to get confidence? Confidence comes from experience. When you succeed at something 2 or 3 times, you get confident. One of the reasons I'm very confident going against the grain is I started early. I've had dozens of situations where everyone has said, do it this way. And I've done it the other way, and it's worked better. Well, that's an earned confidence. Confidence comes from experience. And anyone in a support role needs to have the experience of succeeding with their own trauma and with their teammates' trauma. Because only that confidence from experience is going to allow a team member to be in a mode of being of service. Now, why? Why do we have sociopathic behavior? It's very simple. It's not fun to be in a sociopathic state. It is not fun. Nor does someone in a sociopathic state induce that sociopathic state unilaterally. A sociopathic state is induced by an environment when the needs and emotions and regulatory protocols of an individual are so violated by its entire environment that the emotional signals received and emerging in response to that dissociated, dysregulated, unattuned environment become overwhelmingly painful and threaten the individual's sense of being able to survive and process that level of pain, fear, panic, and all the emotional cues that the environment is not safe. When that state is not responded to by a single person in their environment, that person shuts off and dissociates instinctively from their emotions, entering a sociopathic state, a state in which that individual can navigate and survive without any regard for the impact on other people, but purely focus on survival. Well, why is someone so self-centered? Because they're in a sociopathic state. What's triggered the sociopathic state? Trauma. What's triggered the trauma? The environment. So if we get this, there's nothing wrong with the infants being born in any of the 10,000 cultures throughout history. But there's something very violent and unregulated about many areas within Western culture that produce more in men, because men have less room for empathy within their cultural norms. So as a woman may get into overwhelm and start crying, she's not shamed, humiliated, teased. Well, now she is, because the whole movement is, men and all that. But women traditionally can cry and express their overwhelm and be comforted and loved back out of trauma. A man cannot do that traditionally. He cannot weep. He cannot express need. So the man is more likely within the within the disintegrated state of our culture to enter a sociopathic state, and is more likely to resist support and need, because this will be viewed as weakness because it's feminine, and will be shamed, which is a further trauma. Shame is a trauma. So it's a very, very difficult state if you are traumatized as an American man, because you're pretty much fucked whichever way you go. First of all, you've been traumatized. Now you've got a choice. You can either pretend that it's no big deal when you can't get out of it without help, or you can be shamed for expressing need for help, and you can shame yourself because the abuse of chauvinism has been so internalized that we've been brainwashed into feeling like there really is something wrong with having needs if we're a man. So it's very, very difficult. So of course there are more men in sociopathic states. Now, we then layer it on to them by pretending that being manipulative is their nature, as opposed to who they become in an unhealthy environment, number one. Number two, thinking that any benefit from a sociopathic state outweighs the benefit of being in a humanized, empathic state, which of course it doesn't. When you are in a sociopathic state, you may get satisfaction at various things that tell you you're in control and thus safer in an unsafe environment. But there is nothing that can replace the loss of the ability to give and receive love. It is the most basic human need, and it is the most pleasurable need when it's met. When you are in a sociopathic state, you cannot give and receive love, but you also cannot be empathic and thus outside of yourself. Now, we then turn around and judge that. You are so self-centered. In order for someone to be that self-centered, for example, myself, I've been called self-centered a great deal. In order for someone to be this self-centered, one has to be in a semi to full sociopathic state. In order for an individual to be in a semi to full sociopathic state, which remember is not as fun as a state capable of giving and receiving love. That's where all the juice is, all the pleasure, all the joy, everything else is a substitute. It's a compromise. It's a very weak coping mechanism. So for someone to be in a sociopathic state, it means that there is not a single person in their environment with the capacity and the willingness to both see them, see who they are, see how who they are has been shunted off through dissociation, look and see the trauma that led to that, and help the person back into an associated state. Because as soon as we are in an associated state, we are in an empathic state. As soon as we're in an empathic state, we care about other people. And as soon as we care about other people, we are no longer behaving self-centeredly. But in this kind of tragedy of the abused, what we do in our culture is, first of all, no training for the parent, no emotional literacy for the parent. Go ahead, express your freedom to have kids. Then we abuse a percentage of our children to such an extent that they dissociate, develop PTSD, complex PTSD, become numb, enter sociopathic states. Then we shame them for that. Then if there's any, and if you're a man, if there's any deep emotion and grief and helplessness expressed, you are shamed and beaten for that, further accentuating the sociopathic state. And then, for good measure, rather than apologizing, I'm so sorry that this is the world we've got ready for you, American man. Psychopathic parents, complete emotional illiteracy will shame you if you don't like it and have needs around it. And then once you enter into heavy self-centered survival mode, we've got a whole host of judgments to just throw at you. And then we're going to say, this is who you are. This isn't us. This isn't our level of emotional illiteracy. No. This is you. This is who you are. You're selfish, you're evil, you're horrible, you're insensitive. Why didn't you know this? Well, maybe because I didn't receive a single hour of emotional literacy training in high school, preschool, kindergarten, or college. Maybe because my parents lied about this. Well, we don't even want to hear about that. That's weak. You're a failure. Let's shame you and recreate trauma and then blame you for the sociopathic state that is a byproduct of that trauma, and then say it's all your fault, which is further dissociative, which amplifies the sociopathic state. And then we'll just complain again that you're behaving sociopathically. It's insane. It's absolutely insane. So a module needs to address the grief of this for men, because when a man realizes, maybe for the first time, that they're not actually a sociopath. They've been behaving sociopathically by being induced into a sociopathic state by thousands of unregulated violations of who they are throughout a lifetime. And no one's ever seen them as who they are. There's an enormous grief at a lifetime lost to traumatic coping mechanisms. And of course, there's no place in this culture for men to cry at the grief level that we're talking about. So some of them will reenact the trauma to dissociate, to escape the grief. I've been doing that for about 5 years since that grief, because the grief had no name. It's like, what am I so miserable about? I'm making lots of money, I'm doing this, I'm doing that, I'm doing this, I'm doing all the things this culture says are great things. And this grief is just coming up and it has no name. What is it? I feel out of control. I feel unsafe. I start flailing around. I start pushing this boundary and pushing that. I start hurting myself. I'm trying to get a handle on something. Because this pain is so invisible in an emotionally illiterate culture, it doesn't even have a name. And of course, the name is trauma. The name is grief, about losing who I am for decades. And even if you have a mental state, like, thousands of hours of meditation and therapy and something, and you're into metaphysics. I was doing channeled work since I was 12 years old. I went to the Findhorn community in Scotland, was reading Rudolf Steiner. Even if you've got mental frameworks, if you're dissociated emotionally, you can't feel it. It doesn't have the meaning. It creates a bigger gap between feelings and thoughts. between my body that's doing one thing, my mind that's thinking. This is dissociation, it's not integration, and there's a tremendous loss of energy. So a module needs to address this before we are safe to interact with others. I would say that it's hard for me to think of a woman that I've met and spent time with. Actually, I'm just remembering one. It's hard for me to think among 70 lovers. And some people say, oh, 70 lovers. Well, that's one of the griefs around being dissociated emotionally. When you're dissociated emotionally, you've got a mental map to start saying, okay, this is good, this isn't good, this you use the best map that you can. And okay, this is showing up as dangerous. There's a lot, and trauma has been showing up in all of those relationships without the language to talk about it. Now, so this is a big deal. Ann Watts, amongst others, has told me that I have a genius level of self-awareness and that I cannot expect other people to keep track of what I'm tracking in myself or to know themselves as well as I know myself. Now, whether that's true or not, the point is, I have not been safe for other people in the most important area that they need safety, which is around trauma. And they have not been safe for me in the most important area that I need, which is trauma. And the reason for that is blanket ignorance, willful ignorance. I was absolutely astounded, having stumbled across trauma from a stranger in a cafe after $140,000 of therapy, and realizing as I downloaded the book and read it in the next 3 hours, and like, oh my God, this is the blind spot. This is why I'm breaking up right and left. This is why I'm terrified here. Wow. This is why Peter's hurting me. This is why I've been hurt. This is, wow. And I request that this be brought into high. And I have Jason going along with, governments all around the world that deny this phenomenon of trauma and, in the last few centuries to save money on veterans payments, saying this isn't a high thing. We're committed to everyone winning. We're just not committed to teaching the things that will allow them to win. And that's a big reason I'm making these recordings, is I don't believe you can win with what high teaches as a steady, confident statistic. And whether you can or not, and more power to you if you can, I can't. And I see a lot of people coming back again and again. And there is a tendency to self-shame when you fail. But think it must be because of you, that deep myth of unlovability and all that, as opposed to just an absence of good technology. We need this module introduced to a point where the team is confident, where the facilitators are confident. Because I can say with absolute certainty that in the 5 days after I contacted all facilitators to deal with the biggest trauma in my life precipitated by Peter Sandhill, that my sense of overwhelm, dread, panic, dissociation and all went up 500%. And it was at the lifetime peak. Now, I haven't recalled all my childhood memories. There's a great deal that's dissociated. So it could be that it won't be the lifetime peak once those come in. But I can say for certainty it's the lifetime peak that I have any awareness of. Now, that is abominable. Well, okay, people make mistakes, people are ignorant. All you have to do is read this and start doing that. Where it becomes truly sick is when you have teachers, leaders, facilitators actively more concerned about their self-image than being safe for their community, participants, and therapeutic patients. Because there's no good reason to pretend that trauma doesn't exist, but go on stating a mission statement that we're committed to a world where everyone wins. Everyone is not winning. I have not won with my 30 high lovers. I would say many of them would say they haven't won with me. And yet, if you look at what I do and don't do in my relationships, I don't think anyone would say I'm a poor person doing the things that high teaches, asking for 100%, making requests, stating boundaries. I'm great at that, but I'm failing. Not because I'm bad at learning what I've learned, but because it hasn't covered the terrain that was most relevant to me or my partner's well-being. And it has not prepared any of the, if I've been with 30 high partners and not a single one of them knew about trauma and talked about it, that's a pretty high level of illiteracy in the most important area. I say the most important area because most of us, it's not going to kill a relationship. If we say, oh, I didn't know that, let me change that. But it may kill a relationship to lie about something, to obfuscate it compulsively at all costs, to do something addictively to manage the overwhelm of a dissociative memory and pretend that nothing's happening. That may absolutely kill relationships. I would say that a great number of the sexual betrayals that happen are not because men can't keep their dicks in their pants or anything like that. I think there's a lot going on in these unspoken arenas, and that sometimes if a relationship is getting too close to a deep trauma that the person doesn't know how to deal with, they will just quickly do something to end it. I've watched women do this multiple times, and one of the easiest ways to get a woman to go away is just to fuck around. But if it's an illusion to pretend that that's the real issue, it's not. What is? What is such a big deal that someone would give up a deep love just to avoid not dealing with it? There's very few things, but a life and death experience, the definition of trauma, the terror that one is going to die, is bigger than love in the biology. I mean, when you are smitten with love, your biology is not overwhelmed with a circuit that binds you to be this, that, and the other. But when you are smitten with terrain that some part of your brain recognizes as life and death situation, you are compelled into behaving in a way that enacts this traumatic protocol in the biology. And the feelings get frozen in place if you don't understand what they are. So this is the module that I would have liked to have taught by any of the facilitators in my one-on-one work and in my first level 1. I believe that you and I are intelligent enough to grasp this. I believe that you and I want to succeed. I believe that you and I are loving at the core nature. And I believe that if given the opportunity to have the support of a circle that can let us come into this deep grief there's a deep breakdown of the sociopathic state, of the dissociated state, of the frozen traumatic state, and come back into who we are. That we can be potent, loving individuals, that we have always been potent, loving individuals, but that we can bring our consciousness back into who we are. And that our success rate at loving and being loved will go up 80% over trying to navigate relationships at an emotionally high illiteracy rate that doesn't even understand trauma, let alone how to deal with it, let alone how to talk about it. So that's my passion at this time, and I hope it supports you deeply in having the love that you've always deserved, that you've always wanted, that's always been your nature, but that may have been eclipsed by so many shields and so many layers of this trauma that you've never really had the opportunity to see yourself and be seen. I'm just for the first time seeing myself and feeling it. And it's a beautiful experience. So I'm really excited to imagine you doing that. And I'll just add, because finding human beings, particularly in the West, therapists or otherwise, who can honor and love this terrain is so rare that I've ended up just opening up to spirit world and just going into this deep grief in this circle of love that's around me. And I couldn't do it totally alone. And so I've been so lucky to have a young woman who's able to receive all of my love and able to honor and love me in all of my stuff. And it's been my first relationship understanding what trauma is. And it's been my first relationship to grow this much. And so it's really exciting to kind of look at this and realize it's a turning point. And I'm glad to share it with you.